The winds along Ocean Parkway had always whispered secrets, but no one truly listened until the bones began to surface. In the early morning haze of December 2010, a police officer walked the brush near Gilgo Beach. His task was simple: continue the search for Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman who had vanished months earlier after a frantic 911 call. Her voice had been laced with terror, her words nearly unintelligible. She said someone was after her. Then the line went dead. The officer's search that day didn't lead to Shannon, but to something worse. A burlap sack protruded from the dune grass, unnaturally placed, as if someone wanted it hidden but not buried. Inside was the skeletal frame of a woman, wrapped tight like discarded cargo. The air grew colder as more officers arrived, the sand suddenly a graveyard. Within days, 3 more remains were found, all positioned similarly, all women, and all eventually linked to a chilling pattern. They called them the Gilgo Four: Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. Each a sex worker. Each disappeared after a cryptic online advertisement. Each body discovered near the same stretch of desolate coastline. Investigators tried to keep a lid on the panic, but the media caught the scent. Gilgo Beach became a name that burned into the national consciousness, a picturesque beach town now stained with horror. Journalists descended, theories proliferated, the public demanded answers, but behind the scenes, Suffolk County law enforcement was fracturing. Chief James Burke, charismatic, volatile, and ruthlessly protective of his authority, shut down FBI involvement early on. Surveillance data vanished. Leads were delayed. Burke himself would later be convicted for beating a man in custody and orchestrating a cover-up. Some whispered he had more to hide. With the task force crippled by internal rot, the case went cold. Years passed. The dunes grew wild again. Shannon Gilbert's body would eventually be found in a marsh not far from the others, her cause of death never definitively ruled. Officials labeled it accidental. Her family screamed otherwise, and the killer, whoever they were, faded into shadow. Then, in 2022, everything changed. A new district attorney, a new police commissioner, and with them a new task force, leaner, quieter, built in secrecy. They didn't talk to the press. They didn't hold pressers with flashy sound bites. They hunted. They began by revisiting the digital footprints, burner phones, cell tower pings, cross-referencing online ads with known IP addresses. It wasn't flashy police work. It was forensic precision. And slowly, a name emerged: Rex Hoylman, an architect, a man with a family, a firm, and a double life. His online alias traced back to disposable email accounts, all linked to the Gilgo Four. Cell data placed him near the victim's last known locations. Surveillance showed him disposing trash with surgical caution. By the summer of 2023, they had enough. He was arrested outside his Manhattan office, an unassuming figure in a dark jacket, carrying a lunch he'd never get to eat. In his home, they found vaults, weapons, and troves of disturbing searches. The media dubbed him the Gilgo Killer. But even then, the mystery deepened. Hoylman maintained his innocence. His attorneys called the evidence circumstantial. They claimed the digital trail could be faked. But the evidence kept stacking up, meticulously gathered, chain of custody airtight, each new revelation like a nail in the coffin of his plausible deniability. And as the trial date approached, a quiet dread settled over Long Island. Reporters returned. Old photographs resurfaced. Families rehearsed impact statements they had waited a decade to deliver. Inside the courthouse, time slowed. The prosecution came prepared. They had maps, timelines, metadata, and the haunting stories of 4 women whose lives had been erased. The defense came with doubt, reasonable doubt. Their job was not to explain away the horror, but to muddy the narrative just enough to make truth indistinct. But for the jurors, there was no escaping the weight. Each day they sat beneath fluorescent lights, watching fragments of human tragedy unfold, audio clips of final calls, grainy photos of shallow graves, expert testimonies laced with quiet emotion. And then there were the families. Mothers who hadn't spoken to the media in years, now forced to relive the moment their daughters stopped calling. Brothers who remembered the holidays that passed with one chair empty. Children now grown who never knew their mothers but stood bravely on the witness stand to say, "She was kind. She was trying to survive." Outside, the courthouse was wrapped in cameras. Nightly broadcasts dissected the case. Podcasts obsessed over the smallest gestures, the way Hoylman crossed his arms, how he blinked during testimony, whether he mouthed a word when the verdict was read aloud. But inside that jury room, the pressure was something else entirely. It wasn't just about whether the evidence fit. It was about what kind of justice is possible after so many years of silence. Was it justice if some of the victims were still unnamed? If others had yet to be found? If the system that failed them had only now begun to care? When the verdict finally came, it wasn't accompanied by gasps or applause, just silence. Rex Hoylman, guilty of murder, of premeditation, of unspeakable depravity. He didn't blink. The courtroom did not cheer. There was no catharsis, only the exhale of those who had waited too long to hear that single word. After the verdict, the courtroom sat frozen in its silence. Reporters lowered their pens. The families didn't cry, not yet. It was as if grief had become an old companion, and justice, though long awaited, still felt distant, incomplete. The judge's voice cut through the stillness, delivering the sentencing. Life without parole. No possibility of release. Not even in death would Rex Hoylman leave a legacy beyond what he had taken. The bailiffs stepped forward. He was escorted from the courtroom without resistance, without a glance at the families whose lives he had shattered. No apology, no plea, only a blank stare. One final echo of the chilling vacancy he had operated with for so long. But this was not the end, not yet. In a follow-up hearing days later, prosecutors began proceedings for a 4th murder charge, Maureen Brainard Barnes, whose case had long lacked the forensic link tying her to the others. Now it seemed the puzzle was clicking into place. Investigations into additional victims were announced as ongoing. There was no illusion that the full count would ever be known, but what had been darkness was now pierced by an unrelenting light. Hoylman was moved to maximum security prison upstate, placed under suicide watch. His lawyers, emotionless, began assembling an appeal they knew would likely fail, but the process must be followed. It always must, even when the crime defies human logic. Outside the courtroom, the world began to shift. For the families, the verdict brought a strange duality, a brutal finality, and a new beginning. There would be no more press conferences begging for attention, no more pleading with disinterested detectives. Their daughters, sisters, mothers would never come home, but they would not be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to grow from the tragedy. Purpose. A non-profit foundation was born from the ashes, named in honor of the victims, aimed at preventing the same fate for others. Its mission? To support mental health services, sex worker safety programs, and digital forensics training across police departments. What had once been just 4 names on a spreadsheet now became scholarships, gardens, plaques. The Gilgo Beach Memorial, once proposed as a political gesture, was now real, and it was needed. The community fast-tracked construction, designed not as a monument to horror, but reclamation of peace. It was nestled into the same dunes where the bodies were found. The designers understood that this place could never be returned to innocence, but it could become sacred. The memorial was simple, low to the ground, shaped like a crescent moon. Steel plates bore the names of the women, weather-resistant but unpolished, left raw just as their stories had been. Next to each name, the date they vanished. Next to those dates, blank spaces, reserved for the still unidentified. At its heart stood a small lighthouse, human-sized, no beacon, just an inscription etched at eye level. Every life is worth the light. Visitors began to arrive. Some brought flowers, others brought silence. Children who had once been held tightly by grieving parents now stood alone, older, changed. One of them, Megan Waterman's daughter, stood at the dedication ceremony. Her voice was steady, her words sharper than any reporter's headline. My mother was not a statistic. She was not a case file. She was a person, and she was failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her. The crowd stood quiet, their heads bowed not in shame, but in reflection. Her words became etched in the minds of every journalist present. They were quoted, printed, retweeted, but more importantly, they were believed. Yet, as reform took root and memorials rose, the investigation did not stop. Cold case detectives, freed from the incompetence and corruption that had once stifled their work, began sifting through remains that had never been matched to names. Forensic genealogy, once experimental, was now a lifeline. DNA from bone fragments, cross-checked with national ancestry databases, began to speak. In 2027, 2 more names were recovered from the silence: Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor. Their full identities were confirmed. Their final stories, long buried in time and shame, began to surface. Their families, some estranged, others unaware they had ever gone missing, were stunned. But in that shock, there was something more, a sliver of peace. Closure, even when painful, was still a gift. Each name unearthed was a resurrection. Every profile brought forward became a reckoning. The public began to understand just how many had fallen through the cracks, not just at Gilgo Beach, but across the country. And in Massapequa Park, where Hoyerman's quiet suburban home had become infamous, the echoes of the crimes could not be silenced. For years no one would touch the property. It stood like a scar on the neighborhood, windows dark, lawn overgrown, its brick walls steeped in unease. Parents crossed the street with their children. Dogs barked at its shadow. Even the mail stopped coming. Eventually, the town made a decision. They tore it down. In its place rose a community garden, organized by high school students and volunteers. They didn't plant roses or daisies. They chose lavender, sage, plants of healing. Between the rows, handmade wooden signs bore quotes about survival, memory, resilience. At the gate, one simple message: this ground once hid a secret. Now it grows the truth. The media, of course, moved on. Headlines shifted. Outrage faded. Other stories, other killers, other disasters filled the screens. But Gilgo Beach did not disappear. It became something else, a case study, a lesson, a scar that never quite healed. In universities, the Gilgo case became required reading. Criminal justice courses dissected every step, from the failures of the original investigation to the triumph of modern forensic work. Professors taught it not as a story of crime, but of systemic failure and hard-earned justice. In time, it would become clear. The story of Gilgo Beach wasn't about a killer. It was about the cost of not looking, and what happens when someone does.
Years passed, but the imprint remained, etched into the consciousness of a nation and into the restless sands of Gilgo Beach. After the trial, a slow but seismic shift rattled through Suffolk County's law enforcement. The very institutions that had failed these women were now under scrutiny. It began quietly, with audits, internal, painful, revealing. They uncovered what survivors and families had long suspected: outdated protocols, missing evidence, biased case handling, and a chronic underfunding of victim services. The truth was uglier than incompetence. It was negligence with a badge. Public pressure surged. Whispers became demands. The Suffolk County Police Department, once opaque and dismissive, was now forced into the light. Under intense civilian pressure, a review board was formed. Independent, permanent. Their purpose? To oversee how departments handled cases involving missing persons, especially from vulnerable populations: sex workers, LGBTQ+ individuals, transient youth, the undocumented, those who had been treated as footnotes. The system wasn't just changing, it was being rebuilt. State lawmakers responded with urgency. In 2028, the Gilgo Accountability Act passed with bipartisan support. It wasn't just a political victory, it was a rare moral one. The bill mandated a centralized, statewide database of missing persons and cold cases, forcing police departments to communicate in real time. The days of siloed records and departmental rivalries were over. But that wasn't all. The act introduced new curriculum for law enforcement cadets, digital literacy training designed for modern crime, burner phones, VPNs, encrypted messages, dark web forums. Investigators would now be expected to understand the battlefield as it truly was. It was proof that the Gilgo case, once buried under bureaucracy, had transcended its origin. It had become a reckoning. Meanwhile, the Gilgo Beach Memorial reached its final phase of construction. Nestled near the stretch of Ocean Parkway where the first remains had been discovered, it stood like a sentinel of memory. It did not rise like a monument, but sank into the dunes, as if to stay rooted in the earth that had once hidden death. The names of the victims were laser-etched into steel plates, not polished, not glossy, raw, defiant against the salt winds and searing sun. Next to each name, the date they vanished. Next to many of those dates, blank spaces, unfilled, open. Space for the unnamed. At the center stood the lighthouse, not functional,
symbolic, about the height of an average person. No beacon, just words. Every life is worth the light. People came in droves. Some stayed for hours. Some walked silently, just once, and never returned. Others brought tokens, seashells, notes, photos. A mother left a bracelet in a sealed jar. A daughter placed a worn teddy bear next to the steel plate that bore her mother's name. One day, near the memorial's dedication, the crowd gathered again. Megan Waterman's daughter, now in her 20s, stepped forward. Once a child clinging to hope, now a woman forged by grief. She spoke clearly. "This place isn't just for my mom. It's for every woman who was ever left behind. Every person who thought no one would come looking. We see you now." She paused, her voice catching, not with weakness, but weight. "This is not just a graveyard. It's a promise that we will never let this happen again." The wind picked up, tearing across the dunes, but nothing could scatter those words. Back in precincts and forensic labs, the work continued. DNA that had once sat in neglected lockers was now examined under cold white light. Genetic profiles were rebuilt strand by strand. Matches trickled in, one a month, sometimes less. In 2027, Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor were formally identified. Their full names, their full stories, not just initials on a spreadsheet, not just Jane Doe's. Each identification brought relief and horror in equal measure. For some families, the news came out of nowhere, decades of silence, broken by a phone call. Some relatives never knew they were missing. Estrangement, addiction, broken homes had made disappearance seem almost expected. But now, even belated truth was better than doubt. Each name was a resurrection. Each victim identified meant someone could bury their daughter, their sister, their mother, with a name, not a case number. But not all stories found closure. In Massapequa Park, Hoyerman's old house had become an eyesore. No family moved in, children refused to walk past it, as if evil still clung to its walls. Eventually, the town council voted unanimously. It would be torn down. Bulldozers came one foggy morning, and by noon, the symbol of silence and horror was gone. In its place, a community garden was built, organized by local teens, teachers, and survivors. It wasn't grand, it wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it was sacred. Lavender, sage, rosemary, every herb a symbol of protection, healing, endurance. At the entrance, a sign, simple, wooden, hand-painted. This ground once hid a secret. Now it grows the truth. The news cycle moved on. Reporters were reassigned, documentaries were aired, then archived. But Gilgo Beach stayed. Professors taught it. Activists studied it. Victims remembered it. The case became part of university curriculum. Not just criminal profiling, but empathy, trauma, and systemic failure. It was no longer about one killer. It was about how we fail the most vulnerable, and how we fight to never fail them again. Gilgo Beach, once an obscure stretch of Long Island coastline, had transformed into something beyond geography. No longer just sand and sea, it had become a symbol of pain, of justice, of vigilance. The haunting was no longer just spectral, it was structural, cultural, enduring. The house was gone. The killer behind bars. The trial concluded. But the work had only just begun. In the years following Rex Hoyerman's conviction, a quiet army emerged, not in uniform, but in purpose. Cold case detectives, some retired and others freshly recruited, took up the mantle left behind by the crumbling justice system. With new tools, forensic genealogy, next-gen DNA sequencing, behavioral pattern mapping, they went back into the archives, not to reread, but to rewrite. The unidentified remains began to whisper again. In 2028, 2 more victims were named. No longer Jane Does, they had families, photos, birthdays. Their names were added to the steel plates at Gilgo Beach Memorial, and beneath each, those same painful words: last seen, unknown. Some cases found closure, others remained maddeningly open, but even incomplete answers were a kind of victory, for in the dark silence of the past, any flicker of truth was a triumph. The detectives didn't work alone. Survivors of the sex trade became consultants, educators, protectors. Their trauma had sharpened them. They understood the predator's tactics. They knew the blind spots in law enforcement, and now they refused to be dismissed. New advocacy networks formed, built by those who had once stood on the edge of danger. They provided street-level support, education, and digital security training for sex workers and at-risk youth. Escort platforms that once operated with impunity now faced pressure. Laws were passed demanding user verification, encrypted safety channels, and reporting tools. The emphasis shifted from punitive to protective. Meanwhile, the Gilgo Beach Task Force, originally a band-aid over institutional rot, was solidified into a permanent unit. Its mission to investigate long-term unsolved crimes involving vulnerable populations. Its model was adopted across state lines. Other cities, other beaches, other shadows began to receive the light they'd long been denied. Funding flowed into forensic labs. The DNA backlog, once a national disgrace, was targeted with precision. Thousands of samples, thousands of possibilities. For every file reopened, for every cold lead followed, there was a family waiting, praying, or fearing what would come next. And yet, justice remained uneven. For every name found, a dozen remained lost. Some cases yielded nothing but silence, but even then the pursuit continued, because now people cared. Even as reforms took hold, the emotional weight of the case remained. For the families who had testified, who had endured the spotlight, the media intrusion, the uncertainty, there was no true end, only transformation. Some became activists, others remained private, but all carried the scar of not just loss, but exposure, the grief of having their loved one's death debated, dissected, doubted. Some, like the sister of Maureen Brainard Barnes, devoted themselves to advocacy full-time. She helped train victim liaison officers. She lectured at police academies. Her mantra: ask the right questions. Believe the first answers. Do not make them beg. The cultural impact of Gilgo Beach grew. No longer tabloid fodder, it became required reading in criminal justice courses. Books were written, films were made, but these weren't glamorized thrillers. They didn't glorify the killer. They centered the victims, the families, the failures. One documentary titled The Dunes Remember focused solely on the families. It didn't show crime scenes, it didn't dramatize the violence. Instead, it showed the slow grind of trauma. The birthdays missed, the unopened letters, the photos that stopped in time. The final shot of that film wasn't of a corpse or a courtroom. It was of a mother planting a rose bush in her daughter's name, just outside her trailer in Connecticut, every spring, without fail. These private rituals became the real memorials, the ones no government needed to sanction. A former detective, now retired, now gray, began walking the beach once a month, alone, not as a cop, just as a man who had once turned away from the truth. He walked the shoreline where bones had once lay, where sea and sand had once conspired to bury the forgotten. He walked not to patrol, but to remember. One foggy morning he saw something new. A young woman, kneeling beside the steel memorial plates, sketching. She didn't speak, just drew, name after name, quietly, tenderly, as if giving them back the face time had stolen. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. Because this silent act of remembrance was what justice had become. Not verdicts, not news headlines, but love, sustained, ongoing, undiminished. At the edge of the beach, where the land narrows and the sea opens wide, the Gilgo Beach Memorial still stands. Steel plates pitted with salt and wind, a lighthouse that never lit a thing, but stood its ground. The names hold. They always will. Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainard Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and now more. Names once omitted from press releases, now engraved in history. Their story, no longer a warning, now a reckoning. When the curtain fell on the Hoyerman trial, many believed it would be the final word. The monster caught, caged, and buried beneath 1,000 headlines. But those closest to the case knew better. Justice wasn't a point in time. It was a process. And for Gilgo Beach, the process had only just begun. Behind closed doors and beneath flickering fluorescent lights, a different reckoning was underway. The Suffolk County Police Department, once the gatekeeper of denial and inertia, faced an internal storm. The audits were brutal. They had to be. Files missing, leads ignored, victim reports discarded like trash. For years, serial violence had unfolded in plain sight, and no one followed up. The findings read like an indictment of culture, not just competence. Officers untrained in trauma response, senior detectives unwilling to coordinate with state agencies, a toxic chain of command built on fear, apathy, and antiquated views of the people most at risk. One memo, buried for nearly a decade, had flagged a disturbing pattern in the disappearances. It was dated 2012. No one had acted. When the State Oversight Board released their findings to the public, they didn't hold back. Quote, "This department failed not only the victims of Gilgo Beach, but every citizen who believed their safety was being guarded by professionals. It protected its own reputation at the cost of lives." Unquote. Public outrage followed, but this time it didn't fade. A civilian review board was formed, diverse, demanding, unrelenting. Their mission to monitor all missing persons and homicide investigations, especially those involving sex workers, LGBTQ individuals, and other marginalized communities. No more blind spots, no more buried warnings. New training was mandated. Officers were now required to complete digital literacy courses, learning how to track burner phones, decrypt VPN usage, and identify signs of online exploitation. What had once been niche knowledge was now essential. And with it came a new title, Trauma-Informed Victim Liaison. They weren't officers, they weren't therapists, they were bridges. People trained to listen the first time, to spot what others missed, to advocate inside a system that too often chose silence over discomfort. Their work changed lives. Meanwhile, state lawmakers passed the Gilgo Accountability Act. It was a legislative scythe aimed at the roots of systemic failure, a centralized database for all missing persons and unsolved homicides across New York State. Real-time data sharing between jurisdictions. No more silos, no more excuses. Beneath the cold legalese, the act carried emotional weight. Families who had screamed into the void for years now had a channel to be heard. And within law enforcement circles, it sent a message that sloppiness and secrecy would no longer be tolerated. But Gilgo Beach was not just about what had been broken. It was about what had endured. Near the Ocean Parkway, where the first remains were unearthed, the Gilgo Beach Memorial neared completion. Designed with intention, low to the ground, woven into the dunes, shaped like a crescent moon. There were no towering obelisks, no bronze statues, just steel plates, unpolished, weather-resistant, each one etched with a name, a disappearance date. Next to some names, blank spaces remained, a silent promise. More truths would come. At the heart of the memorial stood a small lighthouse, human-sized, meant to be touched, leaned against. On its side, just 5 words: "Every life is worth the light." Visitors came year-round, some to grieve, some to wonder, some just to sit in silence, letting the wind speak through the reeds. They left flowers, seashells, photographs laminated against the salt air, and sometimes just a note tucked under a stone. We remember. But the most haunting power of the memorial came not from its design, but from its speakers. At the dedication ceremony, Megan Waterman's daughter, now fully grown, stepped to the podium. Her voice was calm, clear, devastating. My mother was not a statistic. She was not a case file. She was a person. And she was failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her. This place is not just for her. It's for every woman who thought no one would come looking. The crowd stood still. No one clapped. Some wept. That moment became a rallying cry for change, not just symbolic, but operational. Law schools began teaching the case. Police academies adopted it into their ethics curriculum. Mental health professionals studied its long arc of trauma. And somewhere in a dusty evidence locker, a case file long forgotten was pulled from the shelf. Because the reckoning didn't stop at Gilgo. Across the country, other departments were forced to confront their own shadows. The ripple effects were subtle at first. An unsolved case reopened here, a digital trail reanalyzed there. But then the floodgates opened. DNA was matched, faces were named. Old stories found new endings. The reforms became a blueprint. Other precincts began forming their own versions of the Gilgo Task Force, interdepartmental, survivor-informed, tech-literate, focused on the kinds of cases too often dismissed: sex workers, runaway teens, trans women of color, people who vanished into silence until someone chose to hear. And in time, the language around the case began to shift. No longer the Gilgo Four, no longer the Long Island serial killer, but the women of Gilgo Beach. Because the story no longer belonged to a man with a rope. It belonged to them, to their families, to the investigators who refused to look away, to the survivors who redefined safety, and to the ordinary citizens who dared to see the humanity buried beneath bureaucracy. Somewhere on a gray winter afternoon, a small girl walks hand in hand with her father past the memorial. She points to one of the names, curious, not afraid, just curious. Who was she? Her father kneels beside her, brushing his hand against the steel. She was someone who deserved to be remembered. And for once, the story ends there. Not with terror, but with truth.
Years passed, but the echo of Gilgo Beach never faded. It pulsed in the background, an atmospheric hum beneath society's noise. To most, it had become a headline from another time. But for those closest to it, the families, the detectives, the survivors, it was never in the past. It was present, constant, and still evolving. In 2027, a breakthrough jolted the cold case division. Using forensic genealogy and next-generation DNA technology, 2 more victims, long known only by their grisly remains, were finally named: Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor. For years they had been known only by file numbers, partial remains, and guesses. Now they were women again, with families, with stories. The news hit like a resurrection. For Valerie's relatives, who had assumed she had simply vanished during a long battle with addiction, the phone call from detectives brought a dizzying mix of grief and closure. "We never even filed a report," her cousin admitted in a press interview. "We thought she didn't want to be found." That assumption had buried her. But DNA had exhumed the truth. Jessica Taylor's mother, when told, collapsed in her kitchen. She had spent over a decade lighting a candle every Sunday, praying for any sign. Now there was a name on a steel plate near the dunes. Now the silence had a shape. Each new identification didn't just bring answers, it breathed air into an old fire. Other fragments, bone, hair, partial teeth, once catalogued and ignored, were re-examined. Cold case detectives, no longer shackled by the disinterest of old brass, began working like surgeons, scalpel precise, obsessed, unrelenting. And slowly, the unknown began to shrink. With each name confirmed, with each thread rewoven, the investigation evolved into something bigger than a manhunt. It became an act of restoration. Elsewhere, in the quiet streets of Massapequa Park, the home once owned by Rex Heuermann stood as an emblem of rot. A perfectly average house on a perfectly average block. Yet behind its faded shutters had lived a predator, shielded by normalcy and cemented by indifference. After the conviction, the house sat empty for months. No one would buy it. No one would touch it. Eventually, it was condemned, then torn down. And in its place, something remarkable happened. Local high school students, many of whom had grown up hearing the whispers of Gilgo Beach, proposed a community garden. They wanted to reclaim the land, not with concrete or statues, but with life. Lavender, sage, rosemary. The garden flourished. A small wooden sign was erected near the path. This ground once hid a secret, now it grows the truth. It became a place where victims' families came to plant, reflect, or simply stand. Some left photographs, others quiet poems written in trembling script. The same neighborhood that had once shut its windows now opened its hands. But beyond the flowers and plaques, the real legacy took root in institutions. Across New York, criminal justice courses were restructured. Professors taught Gilgo Beach not as a case of horror, but as a textbook on failure, delay, and the cost of systemic dismissal. Lecture halls filled with students who didn't want to become just another part of the machine. They studied how evidence was missed, how biases led investigators astray, and how truth required both science and soul. In precincts from Buffalo to Brooklyn, detectives were tired and were brought back not to chase suspects, but to teach. They brought their scars, their regrets, and their hard-earned clarity. You only fail if you forget, and we forgot too many. Meanwhile, advocates who had once fought to be heard from the outside were now inside the room, writing policy, shaping funding, changing protocol.
A new wave of social workers, trained in trauma-informed methods, began to fill roles previously staffed by officers without empathy or context. They asked better questions. They heard what victims weren't saying. They saw what had once been invisible. The shift was subtle, but seismic, and the ripples traveled. Outreach programs changed from punitive to protective. Online platforms, once breeding grounds for exploitation, were forced to update their safety protocols under pressure from watchdog groups born in Gilgo's shadow. Survivor-led networks began training escorts on digital safety, recognizing red flags and reporting abuse without fear of prosecution. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. And in the quiet moments, that movement looked like this: a mother planting rose bushes in her daughter's name each spring, a younger brother lighting a candle every December 13th, his sister's birthday, a former detective walking the beach alone, not as an investigator, but as a man trying to atone. Each of them holding on to something memory-shaped. Grief didn't vanish, but it transformed. One night, during a fall vigil at the Gilgo Beach Memorial, the wind cut bitter through the dunes. The sea groaned beyond the grass. Mourners stood bundled in coats, holding small lanterns. A child stepped forward, maybe 11 or 12, and read aloud, "We remember you not for how you were lost, but for what we found when we looked." Silence followed, then a collective breath. Some closed their eyes, others clutched hands. Because now Gilgo Beach meant more than tragedy. It was a symbol of what survives after silence, of how systems could be reformed, and of how the worst horrors, once unearthed, demanded more than headlines. They demanded change. The lighthouse sculpture stood steady as always, catching the dim light of the lanterns. Salt gathered at its base. The steel plates rattled faintly in the breeze, but the names held firm. They always would. The crimes had been solved. The killer named, tried, and sentenced. But justice, real justice, was still elusive. Because justice, in the case of the Gilgo Beach murders, wasn't a verdict. It was remembrance, reform, and reckoning. In the months following Rex Howerman's conviction, Suffolk County's law enforcement infrastructure underwent the largest internal audit in its history. Behind closed doors, forensic analysts and retired homicide investigators were called back in, not to solve new cases, but to expose old errors. They opened cabinets thick with dust, traced the timelines of leads that had gone ignored, and cataloged witness statements that had never been followed up on. The findings were damning. There were instances where officers had failed to file missing persons reports because the victims were sex workers. One detective, now long retired, admitted in an internal memo that he didn't think anyone would care if a 22-year-old from Atlantic City never came home. That line circulated through the department like a virus. Didn't think anyone would care. It was the phrase that haunted the survivors, that enraged the mothers, that galvanized lawmakers. In response, the Gilgo Accountability Act passed through New York State legislature with bipartisan support. It mandated that every county must now report missing persons and unsolved homicide data into a centralized statewide database. No more isolated precinct silos. No more forgotten victims buried beneath paperwork. More importantly, the act included funding for digital forensics training. Officers were now required to learn how to track burner phones, trace VPN trails, and retrieve deleted messaging app data. Techniques that might have caught Herman years earlier. Techniques now considered basic survival skills in modern investigations. But the system wasn't the only thing changing. The families, once victims themselves of silence and dismissal, became advocates. They testified at hearings, they formed nonprofits, they marched, and most notably, they began organizing support for those still within the shadows, the sex workers, the homeless, the lost. These weren't the perfect victims the media wanted, but they were people, and now they had a voice. In one corner of the newly dedicated Gilgo Beach Memorial, a small group met every Thursday. Survivors, parents, counselors. They gathered under a rusting steel arch not far from where the first remains had been discovered, and read names, not just of the known victims, but of all those who were still unidentified. They called them by placeholders: Fire Island Jane, Asian Doe, Peaches. Each time the names were spoken, a candle was lit, a silence observed, a promise made. You are not forgotten. You are not nothing. You are not next. And in that act, something remarkable happened. The culture began to shift. News coverage stopped sensationalizing. Gone were the headlines about prostitutes on the Parkway or the Craigslist killer. Instead, articles focused on systemic failure, trauma, and resilience. Victims' names began leading stories, not trailing them. Podcasts, once obsessed with serial killer lore, redirected their focus to the women themselves, their stories, their losses, and what their absence left behind. A documentary team, filming for over a year, interviewed former detectives who openly wept on camera, not just for the victims, but for their own blindness. One detective, face drawn, voice raw, looked down the barrel of the lens and whispered, "I see their faces when I close my eyes, every night, and I ask, what if I'd done more?" But guilt was no longer enough. Change had to be structural. The Suffolk County Police Department, under intense scrutiny, appointed its first-ever Civilian Oversight Board. It was made up of social workers, community organizers, former sex workers, and forensic experts. Their task? Review every open missing persons case from the last 20 years. The number? 412. Each file a life. Some would lead nowhere. Too much time passed. Too few leads. But others would open like wounds. And that was the point. Because the reckoning wasn't over. Meanwhile, the community garden at the old Howerman residence bloomed. Local students named the garden Niche, inspired by the digital term, something small, often overlooked, but uniquely vital. Just like the women who had been taken. It became a field trip site for middle schoolers, a study in memory. Children walked the lavender rows, read the signs, and were taught about compassion not in lectures, but through lived history. Teachers didn't sugarcoat the past. They explained how society had failed these women, how systems had looked away, and how that looking away had killed them. At the center of the garden, a bronze sculpture of an open hand stood waist-high, not clenched, not pointing, just reaching. Beneath it, the inscription read, "You looked. That's where it begins." Some cried. Others just stood, staring, letting the weight of it settle. And through all of it, The investigation continued. Cold case files reopened, teeth compared, threads pulled. In 2029, another match was found. A woman known for years only by the tattoo on her torso, cherry blossoms, was identified through a distant cousin's DNA match. Her name was Araceli Santos, a single mother from New Jersey, reported missing in 2005, dismissed, ignored, forgotten, until now. Her daughter, now in her 20s, attended the memorial's annual night vigil and placed a photo of Araceli in the sand. No one knew her name a year ago. Now it rang like a bell.
Time moved on, but the shadow of Gilgo Beach remained, not as a specter to fear, but as a scar to remember. In quiet homes, where candles flickered beneath old photos, families who once begged to be heard now held courtrooms in their memory. They were no longer just mourners, they were the keepers of stories. And for every mother who never got her daughter back, for every sibling who grew up with a name that vanished too soon, there was still one unrelenting purpose: to make the world listen. Each year, on the anniversary of the first discovery, a vigil was held not far from the windswept dunes. The names were spoken aloud, not by officials, but by those who loved them. Children read names. Friends played voicemail recordings left on forgotten phones. One woman played a video of her sister singing karaoke in a cheap motel room, off-key, laughing, alive. The crowd stood still, because that was the truth Gilgo had long buried. These weren't statistics. These were women who sang, danced, cried, and joked, who left behind dreams, mistakes, families, debts, hope. And their humanity had been shredded by silence for too long. Now the silence listened. In the aftermath of Rex Heuermann's conviction, the Gilgo Beach Task Force evolved. What had started as a desperate collaboration of FBI analysts, forensic pathologists, and county officers transformed into a permanent investigatory body. Their mandate? Cold cases involving marginalized victims. Not just sex workers, but LGBTQ+ individuals, undocumented immigrants, and transient populations, those who often vanished without ripple or report. The task force operated out of a windowless basement in Suffolk's administrative building, but their reach spread across state lines. They pioneered new DNA phenotyping software and collaborated with genealogy hobbyists who scoured ancestry databases for partial matches. What they discovered in those digital alleys were lives long assumed lost to time. Some cases were resolved. Others ended with another name carved into the Gilgo Beach Memorial. Still others led only to silence, but even that silence now had witnesses. Among the cold case detectives, one man stood apart. Retired from the NYPD, he had lost his daughter to an overdose in 2003. But he had a theory, one he refused to let go. Her case had always felt wrong. Now, with access to the task force's tools, he dove back in. And what he found was horrifying. Her last known contact? A burner phone that pinged a tower near Massapequa Park. 3 years before the Gilgo murders began. The implications were staggering. Had Rex Heuermann started earlier? Had he tested boundaries? Had others helped? The task force launched a quiet reinvestigation, reviewing any overdose death from 1999 to 2007 involving a female victim in the Tri-County area. What emerged was a disturbing trend: unexamined connections, similar disposal patterns, common geography. Some officers pushed to expand the victim list, others hesitated. What mattered was that the question was finally being asked out loud: how many more?
Meanwhile, in classrooms across the country, Gilgo was no longer just a tragedy, it was curriculum. At John Jay College of Criminal Justice, students dissected the case across 4 disciplines: criminal law, forensic science, digital ethics, and sociology. One class focused entirely on what was missed: the missed calls, missed connections, missed humanity. A guest lecturer, Megan Waterman's daughter, stood before them one spring afternoon. "My mother wasn't naive. She knew what she was risking. But what she didn't know was that the people who were supposed to protect her had already decided she wasn't worth saving." The room was silent. Then she smiled, thin, hard, tired. "That's why I'm here, so that maybe the next Megan Waterman doesn't die alone on a highway." Not all progress was smooth. A national law enforcement symposium in 2030 erupted in argument when a Southern sheriff dismissed sex workers as inherently risky. His remarks went viral, and for days the term inherently risky trended next to Gilgo Beach. Survivors responded with videos, stories, statistics. One woman, a former escort, posted a tearful video recounting how she once reported a violent client to the police, only to be laughed at. That client turned up later in a homicide case. She never forgot the smirk the officer wore. But now people were listening. Platforms began offering digital safety kits for sex workers, anonymous check-ins, emergency signal apps, real-time location pings. Nonprofits work to create encrypted databases of client reports, vetted and managed by peer counselors rather than police. In this new world, the line between criminal and victim was being redrawn. One case stood out. A woman named Jade came forward, claiming she had escaped a violent encounter in the Gilgo area in 2011. She had never reported it out of fear, shame, and because she believed no one would care. Now, in her 30s and sober, she shared her story on a podcast. "I remember his face. He looked normal, boring, like a guy who fixes your taxes." She described the room, the words he used, the way he paused to adjust his glasses before tightening the cord around her wrist. She got away only because he was interrupted. Her case was reopened. Investigators found fibers on her old jacket that matched samples taken from Amberlynn Costello's remains. The connection was undeniable. Huraman hadn't just killed, he'd tried and failed, and others had lived to speak the truth. In that revelation, a strange hope bloomed. Because for every name carved in steel, there were others still walking, breathing, bearing witness. The women who survived, who escaped, who endured, they became the most powerful storytellers of all. And slowly, the nation shifted again. The memorial at Gilgo Beach expanded. New panels were added, not just for victims, but for survivors. Their quotes etched into the brushed steel. One read, "I saw death in his eyes, but I ran anyway. I didn't die, and now I talk so others don't." These words weren't poetry. They were resistance. And the wind at Gilgo carried them, whispering to the sea. By 2031, the house in Massapequa Park, where Rex Heuermann once lived, had become a grotesque landmark, an ordinary suburban home frozen in the mind of the nation as a breeding ground for unimaginable evil. Overgrown weeds choked the driveway, windows were boarded up, and true crime tourists left stuffed animals and Sharpie-scrawled names of the dead on the rotting fence. No one wanted to buy it. No one dared enter. Eventually, the town voted to demolish it. Local teens, college students, and neighborhood volunteers came together not with pickets, but with shovels and seeds. The space became a garden, not ornamental, but intentional. Rows of lavender and sage filled the foundation where a monster once paced. At the gate, a plaque read, "This ground once hid a secret. Now it grows the truth." The transformation was more than symbolic. It was healing. A place once tied to horror was reclaimed by community. Parents brought their children to tend soil where silence once festered. Survivors gathered there in the evenings, not to mourn, but to speak. Poetry readings, advocacy meetings, and quiet reflection unfolded beneath string lights stretched between the trees. It was here that a former escort named Rayla found her voice again. She had never gone to the police. She hadn't trusted them. But when she stood before a crowd of 40 on a breezy September night, she held nothing back. "I used to think I was just a shadow, disposable, but I'm not. None of us are, and I refuse to let my sisters die in the dark." People wept, others clapped, a few stood still, shocked at how much pain had been hiding in plain sight. The garden bloomed. But in police stations and evidence lockers across the country, the legacy of Gilgo Beach continued to crack through the bedrock of old systems. Internal audits revealed how deeply fragmented missing persons databases truly were. Officers had filed handwritten reports into cabinets never cross-referenced. Some victims had multiple identities in digital systems, each disconnected. Tips from the public had been left unread for months, sometimes years. In response, the Gilgo Accountability Act was passed by New York State. It mandated a centralized missing persons and cold case database for all counties, mandatory real-time data sharing across departments, comprehensive training on burner phone tracking, VPN decryption, and the dark web, trauma-informed response certification for any officer working on high-risk victim cases, civilian oversight boards to review neglected or mishandled investigations. What had started as a case study in horror was now reform in motion. At the federal level, the Missing and Exploited Persons Transparency Initiative, or MPETI, was formed. Its first task was identifying the remains still known only as Jane Doe in multiple states. Using forensic genealogy, cold case files, and collaboration with volunteer sleuths, they made slow but steady progress. In 2027, 2 more names were restored to the living: Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor. Their full identities confirmed, their remains returned to families who had waited decades to learn the truth. One relative, an elderly uncle, trembled at the funeral. "We thought she ran off," he whispered. "We didn't know. We didn't know." Closure came not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. Still, it was something. Other names remained blank, but now they were being searched for. The unnamed were no longer abandoned, they were pursued. And in the public consciousness, Gilgo Beach became more than a headline. It became a threshold. College professors cited it in ethics courses. Detectives held seminars using it as a blueprint for identifying repeat offender patterns. True crime authors pivoted from glorifying serial killers to exploring the systemic failures that let them thrive. Even Hollywood responded. A major streaming platform produced a limited series about the case, but this time the story was told through the eyes of a survivor, through the eyes of Melissa Bartholomew's sister who made every phone call, through the lens of Jessica Gilbert's mother whose tenacity cracked open decades of indifference. There was no sensationalism, only silence and pain and fury. In the final episode, the closing shot lingered on the Gilgo Beach Memorial. A sweeping crane shot captured the full stretch, curved steel plates partially buried in the dunes, like bones rising from the earth. The names shone under the gray coastal sky, unpolished, permanent. At its center stood a modest sculpture of a lighthouse, no taller than a person. At the base, one line was etched: "Every life is worth the light." It was no longer a place of horror. It was a place of reckoning, of responsibility, and remembrance. But while some moved on, others never truly did. Detective Ashwin, one of the original task force members, retired in 2028, but he could still be seen walking the beach every December 13th. He never brought flowers, only a notebook. Some days he'd write, others he'd just sit. His wife once asked why he kept going back. He answered, "Because I didn't see it coming, and now I can't look away." Ashwin wasn't alone. Survivors, women who escaped encounters with men like Hewerman, began to organize, no longer silent, no longer alone. They created networks, support systems, and legal defense funds. One group called themselves the Lighthouse Network and offered free legal aid to any sex worker reporting abuse. They didn't wait for police to change. They became the protectors themselves. And so, in ways large and small, the story of Gilgo Beach stopped being about how the women died. It became a lesson in how they were failed, and how that failure, if not met with accountability and change, would continue to echo. But for once, the echo wasn't hollow. It carried with it a promise. Never again.
The wind that swept across Gilgo Beach carried more than the sting of salt. It bore whispers, the kind that clung to dune grass and rustled through steel memorial plaques. Not stories of how the victims died, but of what was done in their names after. Whispers of change born from blood. In 2029, the Gilgo Beach Task Force, once a patchwork of desperate detectives and overworked analysts, was institutionalized. No longer a temporary measure, it became a permanent cold case division, focused solely on crimes against high-risk populations. Its model was replicated across the country, in California, Florida, Illinois. The name changed, but the mission remained. No one falls through the cracks. Retired detectives were brought back to consult on unresolved disappearances, some cases going as far back as the 1970s. Some breakthroughs followed. Others led only to dead ends. But unlike before, those dead ends were documented, mourned, and kept alive for the next set of eyes. No longer buried in forgotten filing cabinets. Social workers trained in trauma-informed response stepped into the void where officers once stumbled. They asked the right questions. They listened the first time. They understood the coded language of survival that victims used, language that used to be dismissed as lies or manipulation. One survivor, who had escaped a trafficker in the early 2000s and lived off-grid for years, came forward voluntarily in 2030. Her tip led to the discovery of a small burial site on Long Island, just 20 minutes from where the original remains had been found. 2 more women. Neither had ever been reported missing. Their DNA was eventually matched through distant familial lines. One had once been a part-time nurse, the other a runaway from a foster system in Pennsylvania. Both had vanished in the early 2000s. Their names were added to the memorial. More steel, more unpolished truth. The national conversation shifted. Activists no longer had to scream to be heard. Now senators and governors echoed their demands.
Advocacy groups partnered with tech companies to create apps and platforms that provided real-time digital check-ins for sex workers. Not surveillance, safety. Emergency pings, encryption, safe contact logs. The technology wasn't used to control, it was used to protect. And in the shadows where predators once thrived, light began to pool. Gilgo Beach became a symbol, not of terror, but of awakening. Universities taught entire courses on the case, not from a criminal profiling standpoint, but through the lens of systems failure. Students studied the bureaucratic breakdowns, the cultural indifference, and the catastrophic delay in action that allowed a killer to operate for so long. A professor at John Jay Criminal College summed it up best in a guest lecture. Gilgo Beach isn't just a crime scene, it's a reflection of what happens when certain lives are deemed less worthy of urgency. Meanwhile, the cultural narratives surrounding true crime shifted. No longer was the focus on the twisted minds of killers. Now the documentaries explored the lives of the victims, who they were before the headlines, before the decomposition reports, before the police pressers. Netflix released a series in 2030 titled The Ones Left Behind. The final episode focused on Megan Waterman's daughter, now grown. In a calm, even voice, she recalled the night her mother disappeared, the unanswered calls, the days that turned into weeks, then years, then silence. I used to dream of her walking through the door again. Now I just hope no other little girl has to stare at that same door, waiting. The series won multiple awards, not for production value, but for truth. The survivors had become the narrators, and with each story told, a myth unraveled. The myth that monsters look like monsters, that evil wears a face we can recognize. Rex Humerman had been a husband, a father, an architect. He'd paid taxes, volunteered at school events, and smiled at neighbors while carrying garbage bags to the curb. The reminder was chilling. Monsters do not wear warning signs. They wear routine, camouflage. That realization permeated every level of investigation now. Detectives were taught to look beyond priors and mugshots, to investigate patterns of proximity and silence, to interview survivors as experts, not unreliable narrators, to question themselves when a case didn't feel worth it. And though not every family would find peace, some bodies would remain nameless, some killers uncaught, the pursuit itself changed shape, from erratic to relentless, from indifferent to informed. The memorial at Gilgo Beach bore silent witness to all of it. Its design remained unchanged, low to the sand, curved like a crescent moon, its metal surface battered by coastal winds. Salt clung to every seam. Grass grew up around the base, untamed. But the names, those names, remained. Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Braingard Barnes, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, and others. Each letter etched not for decoration, but for defiance, because the world had learned the cost of forgetting. And in the quiet moments, when tourists moved on, when the media cycle rotated away, when no one was watching, families still came. A mother planted a rosebush each spring. A younger sibling lit a candle every December 13th. A retired detective left small stones at the base of the lighthouse. No fanfare, no hashtags, just remembrance. At the edge of Gilgo Beach, where the land narrowed and the Atlantic stretched wide, the truth endured. Not the lurid details, not the headlines, but the weight of what it means to see and to refuse to look away again. And as the wind tore at the steel plates and the grasses bent under the tide, something else held fast. The names. They always would.
They had once been statistics, names buried in spreadsheets, causes of death dismissed as overdoses or voluntary disappearances. But by 2031, those names spoke louder than ever, their echoes transformed into demands for lasting change. The story of Gilgo Beach was no longer one about a killer. It was about a reckoning. Some victims would never be identified, their DNA unmatched, their families long fractured by distance or time. Yet each new advancement in forensic genealogy breathed a chance of resurrection. Specialized teams combed through decades-old evidence with new eyes and smarter tools, constructing family trees from fragments, half a chromosome, a degraded sample, a single hair. And when identification came, it hit with a force that shattered the silence. One woman, once known only as Jane Doe No. 5, was finally named. Her sister, now in her 60s, had assumed she'd been lost to addiction. She'd never imagined a serial killer. She'd never imagined her sister's bones lay beneath wind-blown dunes, her name whispered in courtrooms and college lecture halls, her face seen by millions on streaming platforms. Closure didn't bring peace exactly, but it brought something harder: the truth. In Massapequa Park, where Rex Human's house had once stood like a specter over the neighborhood, a garden bloomed. Lavender, sage, foxgloves. Local students maintained it, pulling weeds with gloved hands and solemn care. There were no signs indicating the history of the ground, just one plaque. This ground once hid a secret. Now it grows the truth. Tourists came less frequently now. The sensationalism had died down, but the memory hadn't. For the families, healing was neither linear nor complete. Some found meaning in advocacy, others retreated into privacy, but all lived with the same undercurrent, the knowledge that for years no one had looked, and in that neglect horror had rooted itself. True crime podcasts began to treat Gilgo Beach differently. No more haunting music over reenactments, no more speculation about the killer's psyche. The focus shifted to systemic failure and survival, how systems failed women who were vulnerable, transient, or struggling. One prominent podcast host summed it up bluntly: Gilgo Beach isn't about how he got away with it. It's about why no one cared until it was too late. The criminal justice system, once slow to adapt, found itself reshaped. Grants were funneled into trauma-informed policing. Task forces with built-in victim advocacy roles became standard. In certain precincts, it was now mandatory to revisit cold cases every 3 years, particularly those involving sex workers, the unhoused, or LGBTQ+ individuals. And across online platforms, where predators once hunted under the guise of anonymity, new safeguards were implemented. Escort platforms were required to integrate real-time GPS check-in features, emergency contact triggers, and encrypted ID verification. It wasn't perfect, but it was protective. It was proactive. A generation raised on Gilgo Beach case began entering the field. Detectives, digital forensics experts, social workers, journalists. They hadn't forgotten. They carried the story like a scar, and unlike the ones before them, they started their careers already knowing what happens when people look the other way.
There was no dramatic ending, no sudden revelation that tied up every loose end. But perhaps that was the point. Justice, when it comes late, rarely comes clean. And yet it came. Rex Human, convicted and sentenced to life without parole, sat in a maximum security prison. His appeal process dragged on, more procedural than promising. In interviews, he refused to speak, not to the press, not to victims' families, not even to his own defenders. His silence, once a weapon, had become a wall. One reporter described his courtroom demeanor as mechanically hollow. He didn't react when the verdict was read. He didn't blink. It was like the man had never been present in his own trial. But his presence had been eclipsed anyway by the voices of the dead and the living. At the Lighthouse Memorial, another name was etched into the steel. Lynn Costello, once unnamed, now reclaimed. And beneath that, room remained for the missing, for the unnamed, for the stories still tangled in time and in shadows. Megan Waterman's daughter, now a mother herself, brought her young child to the site. She knelt beside her mother's plaque and pressed the child's hand to the name, letting fingers trace the engraved letters. "This," she whispered, "is where silence ends." Because the legacy of Gilgo Beach was no longer the killer. It was the reckoning, the refusal to forget, the steel that would weather every storm and carry names that were once almost lost forever. And somewhere beyond the dunes, where the tide curled and the wind carried no screams anymore, there was quiet, not the hush of secrecy, but the hush of something finished, remembered, held, and never ignored again.